The gavel crashed down like thunder, sealing Magnolia Forrester's fate with 3 brutal words: sold to Brackenridge. Tears carved rivers through the dust on her cheeks as she watched her family's century-old ranch disappear into the greedy hands of the cattle baron who'd been circling their land like a vulture for months. The courthouse steps felt like quicksand beneath her boots, and the jeering crowd of onlookers blurred into a nightmare of satisfied smirks and pitying glances. "Miss, you all right?" The voice cut through her despair like a warm knife through butter. She looked up to find herself staring into the most extraordinary pair of amber eyes she'd ever seen, framed by a face that looked like it had been carved from oak and weathered by honest work. The stranger's hat was pulled low, casting shadows across his angular features, but she could see genuine concern etched in every line. "Do I look all right?" Magnolia snapped, then immediately felt ashamed. The man was only trying to help, and here she was, taking her misery out on a complete stranger. Caspian Wolf had seen plenty of broken hearts in his 32 years, but something about this woman's tears hit him like a lightning bolt straight to the chest. She wasn't the delicate, porcelain type that most men in Willowbrook fawned over. This one had fire in her green eyes, even through the tears and calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work and determination. "No, ma'am, you surely don't," he said softly, offering her his handkerchief. But sometimes the worst days have a way of leading to the best ones. Magnolia studied his face, searching for mockery or false sympathy, but found neither. Instead, she saw something that made her heart skip understanding. This wasn't some smooth-talking cowpoke trying to take advantage of her vulnerability. This was a man who knew what loss felt like. Easy words from someone who isn't watching their entire life get auctioned off to the highest bidder. She said, but her voice had lost its edge. Caspian glanced at the courthouse where Josiah Brackenridge was already holding court with his lawyers and land surveyors, dividing up her family's legacy like pieces of a pie. The sight made his jaw clench. He'd heard the stories about Brackenridge's tactics, the mysterious fires, poisoned water sources, the sudden accidents that befell anyone who stood in his way. "Name's Caspian Wolf," he said, tipping his hat. "And you're Magnolia Forrester, unless I'm much mistaken." Her eyes widened. "How do you? Your grandfather hired me last spring to help with the roundup. Best 3 months of work I ever had." His voice grew rough with emotion. "Jeremiah Forrester was a good man. What happened here today? ... It ain't right." Something shifted in Magnolia's chest, a warmth she hadn't felt since her grandfather's death 6 months ago. The stranger Caspian wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like she mattered, like her fight mattered. "Well, Mr. Wolf," she said, straightening her shoulders and wiping her eyes with his handkerchief, "what's done is done. I've got exactly $30 to my name and nowhere to go, but I'll be damned if I'll let Brackenridge see me cry another tear." Caspian felt something fundamental shift inside him as he watched her transform from broken to defiant in the span of a heartbeat. In that moment, standing on those courthouse steps with the autumn sun setting fire to her auburn hair, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. He was looking at the woman he was going to marry. 3 weeks later, Magnolia's $30 had dwindled to 3. She was learning that pride made a poor substitute for supper. She'd been staying in the back room of Widow Henley's boarding house, working dawn to dusk in the woman's vegetable garden to pay for her keep, but even that arrangement was coming to an end. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Henley said, wringing her apron in her weathered hands, "but my nephew's coming from back east and he'll be needing the room. I can give you until Sunday." Sunday was 2 days away. Magnolia nodded stiffly, swallowing the lump in her throat. She'd been putting off the inevitable, but it was time to face facts. She'd have to swallow her pride and take the job at the Rusty Spur Saloon that Madame Cordelia had offered her. It wasn't respectable work for a lady, but it was honest work, and honest work was all she had left. She was walking through town, lost in her grim thoughts, when she nearly collided with a familiar broad chest. "Whoa there," Caspian said, steadying her with gentle hands. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders." A concern in his amber eyes nearly undid her completely. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd appeared at the strangest moments, bringing her wildflowers when she was tending Mrs. Henley's garden, sharing his lunch when he caught her looking peaked, always finding excuses to check on her welfare without making her feel like charity. Fine, she lied, then caught herself. Something about Caspian made her want to be honest, even when the truth hurt. No, that's not true. I'm scared, Caspian. Really scared. His face darkened. What's happened? Before she could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the bank. Josiah Brackenridge strode out of the building, his silver hair gleaming. In the afternoon sun, flanked by his usual entourage of hired guns and yes-men, his cold blue eyes swept the street until they landed on Magnolia, and his thin lips curved into a predatory smile. Well, well, Brackenridge drawled, approaching with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. If it isn't the lovely Miss Forrester. I trust you're finding our little town accommodating? Caspian stepped slightly in front of Magnolia, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection. Brackenridge's eyes flicked to him with mild interest. And you are? Nobody special, Caspian replied evenly, but his hand had moved to rest on the handle of his Colt. Brackenridge chuckled. I'm sure, Miss Forrester, I have a proposition for you. I find myself in need of a housekeeper at the ranch, or former ranch as it happens. The position comes with room and board and a very generous salary. Magnolia felt sick. She could read between the lines of his offer, could see the hunger in his pale eyes. Thank you, but no. Such a shame, Brackenridge said, his smile turning. Cold. Jobs are so scarce in Willowbrook these days. I do hope you find something suitable before you're forced to make compromises. The threat was clear, and Magnolia felt her knees go weak. Everyone knew what happened to women who ran out of options in towns like this. She's got a job, Caspian said suddenly, his voice cutting through her despair like a lifeline. Both Magnolia and Brackenridge stared at him. Is that so? Brackenridge asked silkily. And what position would that be? Caspian looked directly at Magnolia, his amber eyes blazing with something that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She's going to be my wife. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Magnolia felt the world tilt on its axis. Marriage to a virtual stranger should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a flood of relief so intense it nearly knocked her off her feet. Well, she heard herself say, I suppose I am. The silence stretched like a loaded spring until Brackenridge's laughter shattered it like glass. How touching, he sneered, but Magnolia caught the flash of rage in his pale eyes. A whirlwind romance. When's the happy occasion? Tomorrow, Caspian said without hesitation, his gaze never leaving Magnolia's face. Reverend Morrison has already agreed to perform the ceremony. Magnolia's breath caught. He was lying, he had to be, but something in his steady amber stare told her to trust him. She lifted her chin, meeting Brackenridge's hostile glare with defiance she didn't know she still possessed. That's right, she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Tomorrow at noon? Brackenridge's face darkened like a storm cloud. How, sudden. I do hope you'll both be very happy. The words dripped with venom before he spun on his heel and stalked away, his entourage scrambling to keep up. The moment. They were alone. Magnolia grabbed Caspian's arm. Have you lost your mind? We can't get married tomorrow. We barely know each other. Do you have a better plan? He asked quietly. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. The truth was, she didn't. And worse, the idea of marrying Caspian Wolf didn't fill her with the terror it should have. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to hope. This is insane, she whispered. Probably, he agreed. But Magnolia, I need you to understand something. Took her hands in his, and she felt the roughness of honest calluses against her. Palms, this isn't just about protecting you from Brackenridge, though Lord knows that's reason enough. Truth is, I've been half in love with you since that day on the courthouse steps. Her heart stopped. Caspian, I know it sounds crazy. Hell, maybe I am crazy. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. His thumb traced circles on her wrist, sending shivers up her arm. I'm not asking you to love me back, not yet. I'm just asking you to give us a chance. Magnolia stared into his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. But all she saw was raw honesty, and something that made her pulse race, genuine affection mixed with a desire. So intense it took her breath away. "Where would we live?" she asked, and his face lit up with hope. "I've got a cabin about 5 miles north of town. It's not much, one room. A good well, 20 acres of decent grazing land that I've been slowly buying up piece by piece. Nothing fancy, but it's honest and it's mine." He paused. "Ours, if you'll have it." A cabin in the wilderness, with a man she'd known for 3 weeks. It should have sounded like a nightmare. Instead, it sounded like freedom. "What do you do for work?" she asked. "I hire myself out for ranch work, mostly breaking horses, cattle drives, whatever needs doing. But I've been saving up to start my own spread. Got a small herd already, and the land can support more." His voice grew rough with emotion. "With a partner, someone who knows ranching like you do, we could build something real, something lasting." Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. "You really mean it, don't you? All of it, every word." She thought of her grandfather, of the lessons he'd taught her about recognizing good character in both horses and men. Jeremiah Forrester had always said that a person's eyes were the window to their soul, and what she saw in Caspian's eyes made her heart race with possibility. "All right," she whispered, then stronger. Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that spread across Caspian's face was brighter than sunrise, and when he lifted her off her feet and spun her around right there in the middle of Main Street, Magnolia threw back her head and laughed for the first time since her world had fallen apart. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Caspian Wolf. The thought should have terrified her instead. It felt like coming home. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made everything look like a promise. Magnolia stood before Mrs. Henley's cracked mirror, adjusting the collar of her only good dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes and had belonged to her mother. "You're glowing, dear," Mrs. Henley said, bustling about the small room. "Like a mother hen, absolutely glowing. That young man of yours is lucky indeed." Magnolia touched her cheek, surprised to find it warm. She did feel different this morning, lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. The terror she'd expected to feel about marrying a virtual stranger was nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt a fizzing excitement in her chest, like champagne bubbles in her bloodstream. A knock at the front door made them both freeze. "That'll be your groom," Mrs. Henley said with a knowing smile. Right on time. But when Mrs. Henley opened the door, it wasn't Caspian, standing on the porch. It was 3 of Brackenridge's hired guns, their faces hard as granite. "We're here for Miss Forrester," the leader said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Mr. Brackenridge would like a word before the ... festivities." Magnolia's blood turned to ice. "I have nothing to say to Mr. Brackenridge." "Yep. Miss, don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man said, his hand moving to rest on his gun belt. "Mr. Brackenridge is a patient man, but his patience ain't unlimited. She's not going anywhere with you," the voice from behind the hired guns was quiet, deadly calm, and utterly familiar. Magnolia's heart leaped as Caspian stepped into view, and she barely recognized the man she'd been talking to yesterday. Gone was the gentle ranch hand with the kind eyes. In his place stood someone harder, more dangerous, a man with the coiled stillness of a predator, ready to strike. "This doesn't concern you, Drifter," the leader said, but Magnolia caught the slight tension in his voice. "Anything concerning my wife concerns me," Caspian replied evenly. "She ain't your wife yet. Close enough." Caspian's coat fell open, revealing not just his colt, but a deputy marshal's star pinned to his vest. "Now, I suggest you gentlemen head back to your boss and tell him the lady's under federal protection." Magnolia's jaw dropped. A deputy marshal? How had she not known? Hired guns exchanged uncertain glances. They were tough, but not stupid. Going up against a federal lawman was a whole different proposition than intimidating a defenseless woman. "This ain't over," the leader said finally. "Yes, it is," Caspian replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And if I see any of you near my wife again, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." The men backed away, their bravado crumbling in the face of Caspian's quiet menace. Only when they were completely out of sight did he turn to Magnolia, his hard expression melting back into the gentle concern she'd come to treasure. "You all right?" he asked, reaching for her hands. "You're a deputy marshal," she said, still trying to process the revelation. A flush crept up his neck. "I was going to tell you after the ceremony. Didn't want you thinking I was marrying you just to protect you, but you were protecting me. That's part of it," he admitted. "But Magnolia, I meant every word I said yesterday. Badge or no badge, I'm half in love with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your trust." She studied his face, seeing new layers in the man she'd agreed to marry. The revelation should have changed everything, but somehow it only made her more certain of her decision. A lawman would understand justice, would fight for what was right. And hadn't her grandfather always said that the measure of a man wasn't his profession, but his character? "Well then," she said, smoothing her skirts and lifting her chin, "I suppose we'd better get to that church before Reverend Morrison thinks we've changed our minds." The smile that lit up Caspian's face was worth every moment of uncertainty she'd endured. When he offered her his arm, she took it without hesitation, and together they walked toward their future end, toward the little white church where their new life would begin. Behind them, Mrs. Henley dabbed at her eyes with her apron and whispered, "A prayer for young love and second chances." The ceremony was simple, tended only by Mrs. Henley, the Reverend's wife, and old Pete, who ran the general store. But when Caspian slipped a simple gold band onto Magnolia's finger and spoke his vows, in that steady, warm voice, she felt like the most cherished woman in the world. "I, Caspian Wolf, take you, Magnolia Forrester, to be my wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by your side through whatever comes our way. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our dreams and to never give you cause to regret taking this leap of faith with me." When it was her turn, Magnolia found her voice surprisingly steady. "I, Magnolia Forrester, take you, Caspian Wolf, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, support you, and help you build the future. We're brave enough to dream together. I promise to be your partner in all things, and to never let fear keep us from the love we deserve." The words felt like a sacred covenant, binding them not just legally but spiritually. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, and Caspian cupped her face in his hands for their first kiss as married couple, Magnolia felt something profound shift in her chest. This was right. This was home. The ride to Caspian's cabin took them through some of the most beautiful country Magnolia had ever seen, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, a crystal-clear creek that wound through meadows thick with wildflowers, and finally, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, it's the cabin that was now her home. It was larger than he'd described. It's built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see a vegetable garden behind the house, along with a barn and several outbuildings. "It's beautiful," she breathed, meaning it completely. "Built it myself mostly," Caspian said, swinging down from his horse and coming around to help her dismount. "Been working on it for 3 years, adding a room here and there when I could afford the materials." He lifted her down from the saddle, his hands spanning her waist, and for a moment they stood close together in the golden afternoon light. Magnolia could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that she was already beginning to associate with safety. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, his hand still resting on her waist. Her heart stuttered. "What?" "I know this marriage, I know, conventional, and I know you don't love me yet. I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give." His amber eyes were serious, almost vulnerable. "What I'm trying to say is, there are 2 bedrooms. You'll have your privacy, your own space, for as long as you need it." Relief and disappointment warred in her chest, relief that he wasn't expecting immediate intimacy, and disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. The truth was, she was more attracted to her new husband than she cared to admit. "You," she said softly, "that means everything to me. Good." He smiled and stepped back, breaking the spell. "And now let me show you around your new home." The inside of the cabin was even more impressive than the exterior. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a stone fireplace, handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience, and windows that let in floods of natural light. The kitchen was well appointed with a modern cook stove and plenty of storage, and she could see evidence of careful planning in every detail. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a beautiful oak table. "Most of it. I'd help with the heavy lifting, of course." He seemed pleased by her obvious approval. "I wanted to create something lasting, something that could become a real home someday." "It already is," she said, and meant it. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over their land, Magnolia felt a peace she hadn't experienced since her grandfather's death. Caspian had cooked them a simple but delicious dinner, and they'd talked easily about everything and nothing, learning the small details that would form the foundation of their marriage. "Caspian," she said as the first stars appeared overhead. Thank you for all of this, for giving me a chance at a new life." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the gathering darkness. "Magnolia, you're not the only one getting a second chance here. I've been alone for a long time, and I'd started to think that was just my lot in life. But then I saw you on those courthouse steps, and everything changed. Something warm and hopeful unfurled in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy marriage might actually work." 2 months into their marriage, Magnolia was kneading bread dough when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Through the kitchen window, she could see a cloud of dust rising from the direction of town, and her blood ran cold. In her experience, nothing good ever came from riders approaching at that speed. Caspian emerged from the barn, wiping his hands. On a rag, his face already alert and cautious. He'd been shoeing horses all morning, and his shirt was open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat. Even in the face of potential danger, Magnolia felt that familiar flutter of attraction that had been growing stronger every day. Their marriage had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past weeks. They worked side by side during the day, Magnolia, tending the garden and helping with the livestock, while Caspian handled the heavier ranch work and his deputy marshal duties. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, gradually learning each other's stories and dreams. The physical attraction was undeniable and growing stronger by the day. But they'd maintained the careful boundaries Caspian had established. He was unfailingly respectful, never pressing for more than she was ready to give. But she'd caught him looking at her with such heat in his amber eyes that it made her skin burn. More troubling, she'd begun to want him to cross those boundaries. The approaching riders resolved into 3 figures: Sheriff Hawkins from town, along with 2 men she didn't recognize. Their faces were grim, and her heart sank. "Caspian," Sheriff Hawkins called as he reined in his horse. "We got trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Caspian asked, moving to stand protectively near Magnolia. "The kind that wears expensive suits and has friends in high places," one of the other men said, dismounting. "I'm Detective Morrison from the territorial capital. We've been investigating Josiah Brackenridge for land fraud, intimidation, and suspected murder." Magnolia's breath caught. "Murder? 3 small ranchers have died under suspicious circumstances in the past year," Detective Morrison continued. "All of them had land that Brackenridge wanted, and all of them refused to sell. We think your wife's grandfather might have been one of his victims." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Grandpa died of a heart attack," Magnolia whispered. "Did he?" Morrison asked gently. "Or did someone make it look that way? We found traces of a rare poison in the water barrel at your old ranch house. Same poison that killed the other 2 ranchers." Rage like she'd never experienced coursed through Magnolia's veins. Grandfather gentle, kind Jeremiah Forrester murdered for his land. The grief she'd been carrying transformed into something harder, more dangerous. "What do you need from us?" Caspian asked, his arm coming around Magnolia's shoulders in a gesture of support that she desperately needed. "Brackenridge knows we're closing in," Sheriff Hawkins said. "Word is he's planning something big, one final push to eliminate anyone who might testify against him. That includes both of you. He's hired a dozen gunfighters from back east," the third man added. "Professional killers. They rode into town this morning." Caspian's face had gone hard as granite. Then we'd better be ready for them.
Caspian!
No, Magnolia said, grabbing his arm. The thought of losing him, losing this new life they'd built together, was unbearable. There has to be another way. There is, Detective Morrison said. We can take you both into protective custody until we can arrest Brackenridge and his men. Run and hide, you mean, Caspian said flatly. Stay alive, Morrison corrected. Sometimes that's the smartest play. Magnolia looked around at the life they'd built, the cabin, the garden, the future they'd been slowly constructing together. The idea of abandoning it all made her sick, but the idea of Caspian dying to defend it was infinitely worse. He's right, she said quietly. We should go. Caspian stared at her in surprise. Magnolia, I won't lose you too, she said fiercely, and realized with crystal clarity that somewhere in the past 2 months, she'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with her husband. I can't. I won't. The raw emotion in her voice seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His amber eyes searched her face, and she saw the exact moment he understood what she was really saying. You love me, he said wonderingly. Yes, you stubborn fool. I love you. Which is why we're leaving right now. But even as she said the words, they both heard the sound that chilled their blood, the distant rumble of many horses approaching. Fast, too late, Sheriff Hawkins said grimly, reaching for his rifle. They're coming, inside, Caspian ordered. But Magnolia was already moving toward the cabin, her mind racing. She wasn't going to cower while the man she loved fought for their lives. She was going to fight beside him. How many rifles do we have? She called over her shoulder as she burst through the cabin door. Magnolia, what are you? Caspian began. Following her inside. I'm not hiding, she said firmly, pulling her grandfather's Winchester from above the mantelpiece. Jeremiah Forrester taught me to shoot before I could properly ride, and I'm not about to let Brackenridge murder the only family I have left. Caspian stared at her for a heartbeat. Then his face split into a grin that was equal parts pride and fierce affection. God, I love you. Good, she said, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Because I plan on being around. For you to prove it for the next 50 years. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer. Through the window they could see the dust cloud spreading like a brown stain across their peaceful valley. Positions, Detective Morrison called from outside. They'll try to surround us. The next hour passed in a blur of gunfire and smoke. Brackenridge had indeed brought professional killers. But he'd underestimated the determination of people fighting for their home. Magnolia proved to be as deadly with a rifle as she'd claimed, picking off 2 of the hired guns with shots that would have impressed her grandfather. Caspian fought like a man possessed, moving with the lethal grace of someone who'd survived countless battles. But it was when Brackenridge himself appeared, flanked by his remaining men, that the real test began. Enough. The cattle baron roared, his silver hair wild and his pale eyes blazing with madness. I want Wolf and the woman alive. Kill the rest. The final assault was vicious and desperate. 2 more of their defenders fell, and Magnolia took a bullet in the shoulder that sent her stumbling backward. Caspian's roar of rage was terrifying. As he saw her blood, and he fought his way to her side with single-minded fury. I'm all right, she gasped, but the world was spinning dangerously. Like hell you are, he snarled, lifting her effortlessly and carrying her toward the back of the cabin. Morrison, cover us. But as they reached the rear door, Brackenridge stepped into view, his gun trained directly on Caspian's chest. Touching, he sneered. Young love conquers all. Except, of course, when it doesn't. Time seemed to slow as Brackenridge's finger tightened on the trigger. Magnolia saw her future there, future disappearing in that instant, and something primal and fierce rose up inside her. With strength born of desperation and love, she wrenched herself from Caspian's arms and threw herself between him and the gun, the bullet meant for her. Husband's heart caught her in the chest instead. Magnolia. Caspian's voice was raw agony. As she collapsed into his arms, blood blooming across her dress like crimson flowers. Brackenridge laughed triumphantly. But his victory was short-lived. Detective Morrison appeared behind him like an avenging angel, placing his gun against the cattle baron's skull. "Drop it," Morrison said quietly. "It's over." The remaining hired guns surrendered when they saw their boss in custody, but Caspian barely noticed. All his attention was focused on the woman dying in his arms. "Don't you dare," he whispered fiercely, pressing his hands against the wound to stem the bleeding. "Don't you dare leave me now, Magnolia Wolf. We have a life to build together. Love." "You," she whispered, her green eyes fluttering. "So much." "Stay with me," he pleaded. "Please, love, stay with me." But she was already fading, her breath becoming shallow and irregular. Caspian felt his world crumbling as he held her, this brave, fierce woman who'd saved his life with her own. Then, like a miracle, he heard the thunder of more horses' butt. This time, it was help arriving. Doc Henderson from town, along with a wagon full of medical supplies, was racing toward them across the prairie. "Still breathing?" Doc called as he leaped down from his wagon. "Barely," Caspian said hoarsely. "Then, there's hope," Doc said firmly. "Help me get her inside." Thing. The next 24 hours were the longest of Caspian's life. Doc Henderson worked tirelessly to save Magnolia, and by some miracle or perhaps just the stubbornness that had drawn Caspian to her in the first place, she pulled through. When she finally opened her eyes 3 days later, the first thing she saw was Caspian's haggard face hovering over her. "Did we win?" she asked weakly. "We won," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Brackenridge is going to prison for the rest of his life, and all his stolen land is being returned to the rightful owners." "Good." She tried to sit up and immediately thought better of it. "How long was I? 3 days, 14 hours, and 27 minutes, he said. "Not that I was counting." She smiled at that, then grew serious. "Caspian, I need you to know when I threw myself in front of that bullet, it wasn't some noble sacrifice. It was pure selfishness. I couldn't bear the thought of living in a world without you in it." He leaned down and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness.
Then we're
"Perfectly matched, Mrs. Wolf, because I feel exactly the same way about you." "Good," she whispered. "Because we have that ranch to build, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that falling in love at first sight was the smartest thing either of us ever did." 1 year later, as Magnolia stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Caspian work with their prize bull in the corral, she placed a protective hand over the small swell of her belly and smiled. They'd built something beautiful together, not just the thriving ranch that now bore both their names, but a love story that would last generations. The ranch hand had found her crying at an auction, but what he'd really found was his destiny. And what she'd found in taking that leap of faith with a stranger was a love deeper and truer than any fairy tale. Some stories, she reflected, were worth the risk.